My name is Sriman Nesimha, and I'm filling in for Sankirtan Prabhu, who unfortunately this week couldn't make it, so he's requested me to give the class today. And today we're going to be discussing from, I've been told, Canto 2. So it's really nice to see that we're progressing through Srimad Bhagavatam really well. When Ganesham was giving the classes, we got through Bhagavad Gita in, I think, 19 weeks or something. And now Sankirtan Prabhu is taking us through Srimad Bhagavatam quite swiftly as well, which is really nice. So we're going to be discussing Canto 2, Chapter 5, and specifically I've been told that you're up to text 32 in Chapter 5, and we're going to discuss from text 32 till text 42. So that's about 10 or 11 texts. And I have to say that this particular part of Srimad Bhagavatam is quite philosophical. And that's something that we do see generally with our bhakti literatures. For instance, the whole point that Srila Vyasadeva wrote the Srimad Bhagavatam was for us to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that aspect of the Absolute Truth. So, as we know, the Supreme Absolute Truth is known in three different aspects. The Brahman aspect, which is the impersonal or all-pervasive aspect of the Absolute Truth. Then you have the Paramatma aspect, which is the Lord within the heart, and that was a chapter that we covered earlier on in Canto 2 as well. And then the highest, the pinnacle understanding of the Absolute Truth is to understand God to be a person with whom you can have a relationship with, you can serve him, and there's activities, and because there's people involved, there's a spiritual world, and etc. Now, to come to that point in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Vyasadeva, and Srila Prabhupada mentions this in his purports to the Srimad Bhagavatam earlier on in previous cantos. He mentions that the whole point is that of the previous cantos, before Canto 10, is to gradually qualify the reader of Srimad Bhagavatam to come to the point of understanding Krishna as not just the supreme controller, but as the supreme enjoyer as well. Because generally when we think of God, we understand God to be in control of everything, in control of the material world, the laws that govern the material world, everything that happens in our life. But it's only in the bhakti tradition where we understand Krishna or God to be not just the supreme controller, but the supreme enjoyer as well. Because my Guru Maharaj explains that, in some lectures he explains that in order to enjoy in this material world, you have to be able to exert some control. Unless you're in control of the situation, it's very difficult for you to enjoy the situation. So Krishna is a personality who's in control of all the different energies, both material energy, spiritual energy, and even the marginal energy, which is both you and I. So Krishna is in control of all these different energies, and because he's in full control of these energies, and indeed they belong to him, he therefore is the supreme enjoyer. So these energies work for Krishna for his pleasure. So yeah, so that's in the case of Srimad Bhagavatam. So Vyasadeva presents this philosophy before the 10th canto to qualify us. And then we see, for instance, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, before he starts narrating Lord Chaitanya's Balya pastimes, Lord Chaitanya's baby pastimes in Navadvip, and then gradually the Madhya Leela and the Antya Leela, which is just entirely full of pastimes, practically all of Adi Leela just consists of philosophy about the tattva, about the nature of Krishna, the Absolute Truth, and Vishnu, and how Krishna expands into the three different forms of Vishnu to govern and maintain the material world. And then it starts to talk in detail about the different aspects of the Absolute Truth in terms of the Pancha Tattva. So who is Lord Nityananda, who is Advaita? And one might think that, hey, I thought Chaitanya Charitamrita was just full of pastimes. But as I was mentioning before, our acharyas like Vyasadeva, Srila Prabhupada, and Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, they're preparing us to come to the stage of relishing these pastimes. Prabhupada, in his purports to the Bhagavad Gita, he mentions a very, very nice thing in relation to this. He says that if you have a religion, and that religion that you're following is devoid of philosophy, then it's just mere sentiment. So your religion needs to be backed up by philosophy. In other words, you need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. If you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, then it becomes really ritualistic. And then over a period of time, maybe many generations, people start to lose interest in religion, in following the various rules and rituals. And then they may turn to atheism and that sort of stuff as well. So you need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. So philosophy is needed. And in the same way, if you have philosophy, but that's devoid of religion, then that, Prabhupada mentions, is mental speculation. Because philosophy is supposed to explain things, but if you don't believe in the original source of everything, which is the absolute truth or God, then your philosophy really has no value. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur gives a nice little story, and I'll just narrate this story quickly before we chant Jai Radha Madhava and start the class. So this story is from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's a work. It's called Upakyani Upadesh, which is a collection of short stories which Saraswati Thakur came up with, and he used to quote these many times in his lectures to put forward a certain point, to make a point. And in this connection about how we should know the philosophy behind the religion that we follow, or the process of yoga that we follow, there's a story which Maharaj puts forth called Yes, No, and Maybe. So it's a nice little story. So there was, this is during the colonial times in India when the British were occupying India. So this is a story of one villager, and this villager was illiterate, and he only knew how to speak the local language, whatever language he was speaking in the village, the local mother tongue. But he was seeing that those people who spoke English were seemingly respected in society. Perhaps they were considered to be more high class, like that. So what he did is, instead of actually learning English and what the words actually mean, he just decided to learn just a few words. And by learning these few words, he thought that, yes, when I say these words, then I'll be respected in society. So the words that he learned was yes, no, and maybe. So again, he learned these words, but he didn't understand the meaning of these words. So one day in his village, there was a theft, and a few bandits, a few robbers came, and they stole something from someone's house. And somehow he was part of the intrigue, and he got sent to court, and the judge started to question him. And you know, he was a suspect. So the judge started to question him, and this villager thought that if I now speak in English, I will impress the judge, and therefore I will be let off the hook, and I won't go to jail. Of course, he hadn't committed the crime, but this was his tactic. So the judge asked him, "Did you commit the crime of stealing?" And his reply was, "Yes." Now remember, he didn't know what the word yes means. He just knew it was an English word, and he wanted to impress the judge. So he said yes. Okay, so that's the first strike. The next question that the judge asked him was, okay, so you committed the crime. Were there any accomplices with you? Or were you the sole person that did it, that committed the crime? And his answer was no, meaning that he was the only person that committed the crime. There was no other person who was conspiring to commit the crime. So that's strike two. And the last statement this time that the judge told him was that, do you realize that because you committed this crime, now you're going to be sent to jail. And what was his reply? His reply was, very good. So yes, no, very good. So these three words that he learned without understanding the context and the meaning behind them actually got him into trouble. So when we study Srimad Bhagavatam, along with relishing the pastimes of Krishna and Krishna's devotees, it's very pertinent for us to also understand the philosophy. So I'm just giving you a heads up because this particular part of Srimad Bhagavatam is very philosophical. But we'll start by chanting for a few minutes, Jai Radha Madhava, and then we'll get started. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Gopi Janavallabha Girivardhari, Gopi Janavallabha Girivardhari, Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana, Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Gopi Janavallabha Girivardhari, Gopi Janavallabha Girivardhari, Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana, 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 Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Yamuna Tira Vanachari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Jaya Radha Gopinath Radha, Gopinath Shri Radhe Jaya, Radha Gopinath, Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe Jaya, Jagannatha Jaya, Jagannatha, Baladeva Jaya, Subhadramaya Jaya, Jagannatha Jaya, Jagannatha Jaya, Baladeva Jaya, Subhadramaya Jaya, Gauranitai Jaya, Gauranitai, Gauranitai Jaya, Gauranitai Jaya, Gauranitai Jaya, Gauranitai, Gauranitai Jaya, Gauranitai Jaya Jaya, Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajyakacharya Shutrashata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Abhay Chanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajyakacharya Shutrashata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. Samaveta Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol. So we'll just chant Mangalachan really quickly, just a short one. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurminitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivas Adi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, so thank you for tuning in. Now, because this is a scripture study class, it's more of a study than just a reading of it. Like sometimes we have Krishna book reading classes that we do for some people. So because this is a study, it's always good to refresh the context and the background. And I saw that Sankirtan Prabhu also is doing the same thing as well. So I just want to go through the first few chapters of Canto 2 that you've been through and get to where we are today, which is the 5th chapter of Canto 2, and we're doing texts 32 to 42. And as we cover these texts, when we get to the end, we would have finished the 5th chapter of Canto 2. So how did Canto 1 finish? Canto 1 finished with Shukadev Goswami, the speaker of Srimad Bhagavatam, Shri Vishnu Shravane Parikshita Bhavat Vyasa Kirtane. So out of the 9 processes of bhakti, the 9 limbs of bhakti, Shravanam and Kirtanam. Shravanam, the devotee who is the epitome of Shravanam is Parikshit Maharaj, and the devotee who represents Kirtanam to the superlative degree is Shukadev Goswami. So Shukadev Goswami, the young 16-year-old boy, came onto the scene, and by his bodily features alone, he was identified by the sages and the rishis who had gathered there that this was a very special personality. And they elected him to sit on the Vyasasana to begin reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam. And Parikshit Maharaj asked him the question, the famous question, what is the responsibility of a person who is about to die? And this is a question which is applicable to all of us, because we may have a very young body, but as Prahlad Maharaj mentions, at any time we can die. So because that's the case, Krishna is time, and whenever Krishna wants, and according to our karma, if we're a non-devotee, we will pass away from this body. So it starts off with asking the question of what is the duty of a person who's about to die. And then starts Canto 2. And Canto 2, the first chapter there is called The First Step in God Realization. Shukadev Goswami has now taken the seat, and he starts to, he initially is quite heavy actually. He actually explains how people who don't take to hearing transcendental matters are completely materially engrossed, they're blind to the knowledge of the ultimate truth, and how they're just wasting their day and night engaged in materialistic activities. And he starts to explain the absolute truth in the form of the Virat Purusha. So why does Shukadev Goswami start to explain the absolute truth as the Virat Purusha in the beginning of Canto 2? Because generally speaking, it's very hard for people to understand God having a form. What to speak of just a form, a spiritual form. Because generally when people think of form, and you see this in some religions as well, they say that they don't believe that God has a form because they can't conceive of the idea of a spiritual form. Form to them means matter, because the forms that we see in this world, in the world around us, they're made from matter. And anything which is made from matter, as is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, avyaktadini bhutani vyaktamadhyani bharata avyakta nidanani eva tatra ka paridevana. Krishna explains to Arjuna in the 2nd chapter that anything in this material world which has form, which is practically everything, has a beginning, has a period of manifestation, and has destruction to it as well. So therefore form has a beginning and an end. But the Bhagavad philosophy, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, explains that form can also be made from spirit. And spiritual form that Krishna has, that we also have as individual souls, we have our own original spiritual body, that form is Sat, Chit, and Ananda. It's eternal, full of knowledge, and full of bliss. And in the case of Krishna, that form is unlimited. So our form is limited. We can't be in many places at once. If we're here, like I am sitting here in the temple in the sannyas room, I can't be present outside. I can't be present downstairs in the temple room. But Krishna can do that. Just today in the Srimad Bhagavatam class, we were discussing the pastime of Krishna subduing the 7 bulls that King Nagnajit had in his property. And the task that was given to a suitable prince, if he wanted to marry his daughter Nagnajiti, was that the certain prince had to come and subdue 7 bulls, these 7 bulls. And of course, no one could do it. Krishna did it. And how did he do it? He did it by expanding himself into 7 different Krishnas. And each one of these Krishnas took on one of the bulls. And Krishna, being the strength of the strong, subdued these bulls. And as a result, he ended up marrying Princess Nagnajiti, one of his 8 principal queens at Dwarka. So Krishna's form is transcendental, it's not material, and Krishna's form is unlimited. But the reason why Shukadev Goswami starts to describe Krishna as having a material form, Virat Rup, is because we can conceive only that which we see and perceive with our material senses, initially at least. When we start practicing philosophy or when we're curious about the absolute truth, it's very difficult for us to conceive of spiritual form. So then Shukadev Goswami starts to discuss Krishna in the material aspect as the Virat Purusha. So that's chapter 1 of the 2nd canto. That's why it's called the first step in God realization. Seeing the aspect of Krishna within matter. So the sun and the moon are Krishna's eyes. The trees across the planets, like the planet Earth, this is Krishna's hair on his body. The rivers are his arteries and his veins, etc. So by analyzing and seeing material nature, we can appreciate that God has a form, albeit in a material aspect. Now, chapter 2 evolves. It's called The Lord in the Heart. And here in this chapter, Shukadev Goswami starts to discuss about, he starts to talk about a yogi. So not only is Krishna present outside of us in the material manifestation, but Krishna is also present as the Lord within our heart, as Paramatma. So he's going from the Brahman aspect, speaking about the energy of Krishna in the form of the Virat Rupa. He's now talking about Krishna as the Paramatma, the Lord in the heart. And the yogi explained in this 2nd chapter of the 2nd canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, is explained that he's contacting and connecting with this super soul in the heart. And as a result, through trance, through samadhi, he liberates himself and his soul ascends upwards through the universe, through the different planetary systems, Maharlok, Tapalok, and eventually reaches Satyalok. And when he reaches Satyalok, which is the planet of Lord Brahma, then at the time of the universal destruction, himself, along with Brahma and all the other inhabitants in Satyaloka, they go to the spiritual sky. Now, this is a really long-winded way to go back home, back to Godhead. Srila Prabhupada certainly didn't want us to take this way. He has given to us the Maha Mantra. Of course, Lord Chaitanya has given us the Maha Mantra, and Srila Prabhupada, following in the footsteps, Vande Mahapurushate Charanarvindam, following the lotus footsteps of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, has also bestowed upon us the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, which is the great gift of the topmost planet in the spiritual world, Goloka Vrindavan. So the 3rd chapter of the 2nd canto, therefore, talks about pure devotional service, the change in heart. So there's no need to do an Ashtanga yoga system tinged with bhakti to then liberate yourself and then ascend yourself through the various planetary systems, reach Brahmaloka, and from Brahmaloka go to Vaikuntha. So we don't want to do that. So the 3rd chapter talks about a much swifter way to just directly engage in bhakti without considering karma, without considering jnana, and without considering yoga. So that's the 3rd chapter. Now, the 4th chapter is quite interesting. It's sort of Maharaj Parikshit sort of changes course slightly. Kindly describe, he says, in the 7th text in the 4th chapter, kindly describe how the Supreme Lord, who is all-powerful, engages different energies and different expansions in maintaining and again winding up the phenomenal world in a sporting spirit of a player. Essentially, what Parikshit Maharaj is asking Shukadev Goswami is, please describe to me. I understand Krishna is the control of all energies. Parasya Shaktir Vivida Vishuyate Svabhaviki Jnana Bala Kriyacha. Na tasya karam karanam cha vidyate, na tat shamaschabhyadikascha drishyate. It's mentioned that Krishna has nothing to do, no work to perform, and all the energies which he possesses are simply working for him to fulfill his desires. So he has no reason to endeavor to fulfill a desire. He desires and it's fulfilled. So Krishna being the possessor of energies, how does Krishna engage these energies to create the material world? This is Parikshit Maharaj's first question. Now you may think, hang on, Parikshit Maharaj is going to die in 7 days. Why is he asking about the creation of the material world? Why doesn't he just jump straight into the pastimes of Lord Krishna? Of course, Ante Narayana Smriti, Srimad Bhagavatam explains that of all the work you perform, Etavan Sankhya Yogabhyam, Swadharma Parinishthya, of all the work that you perform, all the spiritual pursuits that you have, that you may be performing, your religion that you're following, the whole purpose of that is judged at the time of death. If you can think of Krishna at the time of death, all your endeavor is successful. Otherwise, Srimad Bhagavatam explains, it's shrama eva hi kevalam. It's simply a waste of time. So he's asking about the material creation because this material creation is in relationship to Krishna, and anything in relationship to Krishna is as good as himself. So the material world is as good as Krishna because it's Krishna's energy, but at the same time, it's not Krishna. This is the Achintya Bheda philosophy. Prabhupada gives the example of the sun and the sunshine. The sunshine comes from the sun, and therefore the sunshine is as good as the sun, qualitatively. But quantitatively, if the sunshine is in your room, it is not that the entire sun is inside your room. The energy of the sun is inside your room. So in the same way, we can appreciate Krishna first by understanding how Krishna's energies work. So this is something that Maharaj Parikshit inquires from Shukadev Goswami in the 4th chapter of the 2nd canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And in reply, Shukadev Goswami, he doesn't give an answer straight away. He says, I am going to recount to you the same conversation on this topic which occurred at the beginning of the universal creation between Lord Brahma and his son and disciple Narada Muni, because Narada Muni had apparently asked Lord Brahma the exact same question. So Shukadev Goswami, following the footsteps of the parampara, will now recount this conversation. So that's the 4th chapter, and now we're up to the 5th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam. So let me just scroll down. I'm just on Veda base. So text 32, here it says, translation, O Narada, so this is Lord Brahma speaking, best of the transcendentalists, the forms of the body cannot take place as long as these created parts, namely the elements, senses, mind, and modes of nature, are not assembled. Okay, so you're probably lost if you don't understand the context of this. So here, Lord Brahma is talking about the creation of the material world, and the most subtle element, you probably may be knowing, the most subtle element in this material creation is the false ego, right? We hear of the most gross thing is earth, then you go more subtle, you have water, then you have fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and then false ego. So the false ego is the first thing to be manifested straight out of the Mahatattva of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So here it's explaining, if you go a few verses back, text 24 of the 5th chapter, the self-centered materialistic ego, thus being trained to 3 features, becomes known as the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So when these 3 modes of material nature, goodness, passion, ignorance, they combine with this original materialistic false ego, three different types or three different categories of things are created initially. So text 25 says, from the darkness of false ego, 5 elements are generated, namely the sky. And if you read through texts 26 to 29, it's explained that sky is the first element to be generated because it's the most subtle. And from sky comes the object of the sense, which is touch. So the next more grosser element after sky, from sky is generated sound, Sound is generated, not touch, it's sound. The next element to be generated after sky is air. And again, if you follow through from texts 26 to 29, you'll understand this. From air, the quality of touch is generated. Then from air, the next more gross element, which is fire. Of course, where there is fire, there's form. One second. Yes, form is generated. So fire is the beginning of form, because you can't see form in ether, you can't see form in air, but you can begin to see and appreciate form through fire. Fire has some sort of a form. After fire, the next most gross element is water. From water comes taste. That's the object of the sense, which is generated from water. And then finally, the most grossest element after water is earth, and from earth comes aroma. So when the false ego is touched by the mode of ignorance, these 5 elements, otherwise known as the Pancha Mahabhuta, sky, air, fire, water, and earth, are generated. And in relation to them, their 5 objects of the senses are generated, which are sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. Okay, so these are generated. Now, when the false ego is touched by the mode of goodness, this is text 30, what is generated? The mind is generated. Not only the mind is generated, but the 10 demigods controlling the bodily movements. So there Srimad Bhagavatam is explaining the controller of air, Vayu, the sun god, the Prajapatis like Daksha, the Ashwini Kumars, the fire god, the king of heaven, and so on and so forth. So when the 5 elements are created, like fire, so along with fire, the demigod controlling fire is also generated as well. So Agni, for instance, Agni is generated. When the sense of form is generated, then the demigod who enables us to see form, the sun, is also generated as well. So all these different things are being generated, and this is explained very nicely in the Sankhya philosophy. If you study the Sankhya philosophy, the 24 elements of Sankhya, you'll understand these different things. Probably won't get into that today, because there's still some verses that we have to cover. But essentially the mind and the demigods are generated when the mode of goodness touches with the false ego. Text 31 explains what happens when the false ego comes in contact with the mode of passion. And you can probably guess what comes. What comes is the intelligence, because you already have the false ego, and then the false ego in touch with the mode of goodness produces the mind, and then the false ego in touch with passion produces the intelligence, which make up your subtle body. These 3 elements make up your subtle body. The mind, the intelligence, and the false ego. And not only that, but the sense organs which perceive things like earth, fire, water, air, and ether are also generated as well. So here, text 31 is saying ears, skin, nose, eyes, tongue, mouth, hands, genitals, legs, the outlet for evacuating, together with the intelligence, are all generated. So 5 of these are your knowledge acquiring senses, which is your ears, your skin, your eyes, your tongue, and your mouth. And then the other 5 are your working senses. Working senses means you still use them to perform actions, but you're not gathering any knowledge from them. Like from your skin, from your sense of touch, you can gather how hot or cold something is. But from your working senses, you can't do that. And the working senses, text 31, are your hands, your legs, your genitals, your outlet for evacuating, and it's actually speech as well. Speech is the fifth working sense. So therefore now in text 32, it's explained, Brahma has explained to Narla that the forms of the body, which are explained in text 31, cannot take place, in other words, are not formed until everything else preceding it is formed, which are the senses, the demigods, the modes of material nature, and the mind, which is explained in text 30. Okay, so that's text 32. Text 33, when all these became assembled by force of energy, by the force of the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, this universe certainly came into being by accepting both the primary and secondary causes of creation. So, what we need to understand is there's two different types of causes. There's the remote cause, or the official cause, and then the immediate cause. If I sit for an exam, and let's say if I score 100% in the exam, would be nice, I might say that I am the cause for acing the exam. So perhaps that's the immediate cause. Yes, because if I didn't sit for the exam and write the answers, I wouldn't have scored 100%. That's the immediate cause. But the remote cause, perhaps, would have been that my mother or my father or my elder siblings, they would have encouraged me and told me, look, you have an exam coming up and that you have to now start studying. And because of them, I started studying, and then I sat for the exam, and then I aced the exam, scoring 100%. So that's the remote cause. So the actual cause was that they told me, they instructed me to start studying, which I followed, and then I scored 100% in the exam. So there's always two different causes. So similarly, in the creation of the material world, there's two different causes as well. The remote cause, the original cause, is Krishna himself, and the immediate cause is Lord Brahma. And these two different causes of creation are subdivided into two things, two subject matters. One is called Sarga, and the other one is called Visarga. So Srimad Bhagavatam has 10 topics, and two of these 10 topics are Sarga and Visarga. Sarga means the initial original creation, and Visarga refers to the subsequent creation once the universal shell has been created by Krishna. So Sarga refers to the primordial creation. So this refers to Krishna in the form of Vishnu, and we're going to talk about that. So Vishnu, he provides initially the elements such as, which are contained within the Pradhan. And these elements are the same elements which we just discussed, and which make up Sankhya Yoga, like the 5 elements, the senses, the working senses, knowledge acquiring senses, all that sort of stuff. So this is the ingredients that Krishna supplies. Brahma can't create the ingredients. Brahma simply manipulates these ingredients, like the elements, to create different bodies, to create different planets, to create the mountains and the rivers, and etc. So the manipulation of the original ingredients of creation, which are provided by Krishna, that is done by Brahma, and that is known as the secondary creation, and that refers to Visarga. The original creation, in other words, the creation of the elements themselves from within Krishna's body, from within Mahavishnu's body, that is known as Sarga. And then Brahma's creation is known as Visarga. So that is text 33. We go on to text 34 now. Thus all the universes remained thousands of eons within the water, the causal ocean, and the Lord of living beings entered in each one of them, caused them to be fully animated. And we'll read also text 35 because it's very closely related to text 44. Text 35 says, the Lord Mahavishnu, although lying in the causal ocean, came out of it, and dividing himself as Hiranyagarbha, he entered into each universe and assumed the Virat Rupa with thousands of legs, arms, mouths, heads, etc. So these two verses, text 34 and 35, they're talking about the initial Sarga creation because it's relating to Vishnu. So Krishna, as you know, he doesn't engage directly in creating and maintaining and destroying the material world. Because Krishna is the supreme enjoyer, he's busy enjoying with his loving devotees and associates in Golok Vrindavan. But because he's the all-merciful loving Father, he creates facility for the conditioned souls to try to enjoy separately from him. So he does this through the agency of Vishnu. So Prabhupada mentions in the purport, it's one of the purports, I think it's text 34 or 35, one of them, it must be 34, let me just double check. Okay, I can't remember where I read it, but it's somewhere in these 10 texts. Anyway, there Srila Prabhupada is mentioning that in the spiritual world, occasionally there appears a cloud. And this cloud, it creates a shadow in the spiritual world. This shadow is the basis for the material world because there's darkness there. Actually, in the spiritual world, there's no darkness. But Prabhupada explains that sometimes there's a cloud, a spiritual cloud, and it creates a shadow. Now, it creates a shadow in a certain section of the spiritual world known as the causal ocean, the Karana Sagar. This causal ocean, which is in darkness because of that cloud, Mahavishnu lies in that. From Mahavishnu, when he breathes, when he exhales, practically infinite universes come from each one of his bodily pores. And when he inhales, they again come back into his body. So if you see from the Vedic perspective, the universe is more like an expansionary, contractionary model of the universe. Scientists are saying that the universe is ever expanding since the Big Bang. We understand that the universe is expanding because Mahavishnu, the original cause of the creation of the material universes, is exhaling. And with the force of his exhalations, the universes are expanding and are maintaining themselves for that duration of time. Yasyeka nishwasita kalamatavalamya jivanti loma vilaja jagatandanata Vishnur mahan ihayasya kala vishesho govindamadi purusham tamam jami. So Srimad Bhagavad Brahma Samhita, Lord Brahma is explaining, here Lord Brahma is also speaking. He's explaining that from the duration of one breath of Mahavishnu, great controllers of the universe like Lord Brahma live only for that duration of one breath. And therefore Brahma is not the original creator, he's the secondary creator. Because Vishnu has to create him from the lotus which grows from his navel. Vishnu Mahan Ihayasya Kala Vishesho is explaining that even this Mahavishnu, from whom unlimited universes, material universes are coming from him, he's just a Kala Vishesha, he's just a small, tiny fragment of the original Vishnu, who is Krishna. So Krishna shows us his compassion by expanding himself further from Mahavishnu, and then from Mahavishnu, he goes within each material universe as Garbhodakashayi Vishnu. And in each universe as Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, he lies on the ocean within the universe called the Garbhodaka ocean. And Lakshmiji is massaging his lotus-like feet, and from his navel comes a lotus stem, which is the source of Lord Brahma. That's how Brahma comes to being. and the 14 planetary systems. And Krishna further shows us his mercy and compassion by expanding himself once again as the Supersoul, as Kshirodakashai Vishnu, into the hearts of every single living entities to ratify their desires and their aspirations. So if you study Bhagavad Gita, you'll understand that there's 5 factors of action, and one of the factors, the most important one, is the Supersoul. You may have a desire, Srila Prabhupada explains, man proposes, God disposes. So you may have a desire, but unless Krishna as the Supersoul ratifies and allows that desire to be fulfilled, it's not going to happen. Once he does that, once he says, okay, yes, this certain person's desire can be fulfilled, then nature, Prakriti, she arranges the external situation for that desire to be fulfilled and manifested. Okay, so that is text 34 and 35. So he's saying that, so Vishnu expands himself within each universe, and then he starts creating through Brahma all the different creations which are there within the material world. Text 36, great philosophers imagine that the complete planetary systems in the universe are displays of the different upper and lower limbs of the universal body of the Lord. So now here coming to a description again of how we can perceive Krishna through the form of his material creation. And a good example of understanding that is in text 37. It's explaining the Brahmanas represent his mouth, the Kshatriyas his arms, the Vaishyas his thighs, and the Shudras are born from his legs. So everything in the material world, the stars, the planets, everything we see here on earth, including us, are coming from Krishna. And therefore, the system of governing society, which is Varnashram, is also originally emanating from Krishna. So therefore, the Brahmanas represent his mouth or his head, because the Brahmanas are responsible for speaking transcendental knowledge to guide human society. Kshatriyo hi prajarakshan. The goal, the purpose of the Kshatriyas is to protect the citizens. But the Kshatriyas don't just protect the citizens' physical bodies, they protect the citizens from lust and anger and greed. How? By putting into effect the transcendental knowledge which is spoken through the mouth of the Brahmanas. So the Brahmanas, when they speak, they're representing the mouth of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Kshatriyas represent the arms of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because Krishna protects his devotees with his arms. We see how Krishna killed the Keshi demon. He got his fist and he put it through Keshi demon's mouth, and Keshi experienced that arm to be like as hot as an iron rod, and he passed away. So Krishna protects his devotees with his arms, and the Kshatriyas are supposed to represent that. The Vaishyas, his thighs, because with our thighs, thighs or the belly, we maintain ourselves through food protection. The Shudras are born from his legs, because with our legs we walk around and we do work. Okay, so we got about 5 or 6 minutes. Quickly go through the remaining verses. Text 38, the lower planetary systems up to the limit of the earthly stratum are said to be situated in his legs. The middle planetary systems beginning from Bhuvarloka are situated in his navel, and still the higher planetary systems occupied by the demigods and highly cultured sages and saints are situated in the chest of the Supreme Lord. Text 39, from the forefront of the chest up to the neck of the universal form of the Lord are situated the planetary systems Janaloka and Tapaloka, whereas Satyaloka, the topmost planetary system, is situated on the head of the form. The spiritual planets, however, are eternal. And what that means is that the spiritual planets are therefore not situated on the body of the Virat Rupa, because the spiritual planets are transcendental to Virat Rupa. They're in the spiritual world, in the spiritual sky, in the Param Vyoma. But the highest position that one can be situated in this material world is on the crown of the Virat Rupa, on his head, and that's where Satyaloka is, that's where Lord Brahma is. But Bhagavad Gita explains that this place also, Brahma Bhuvana Loka, right, is explained that from the highest planet in the spirit, in the material world, down to the lowest, all are places of misery. Because ultimately the purpose of the material world is to rectify the conditioned souls, to make the conditioned souls realize that this is not a place for their enjoyment, and therefore they should practice pure devotional service, as is mentioned in chapter 3 of Canto 2, practice pure devotional service and break free from this material world and go to live in the spiritual world in association with Krishna. Texts 40 to 41. My dear son Narada, know from me that there are 7 lower planetary systems out of the total 14. The first planetary system is known as Atala. It is situated on the waist. The second Vitala is situated on the thighs. The third Sutala on the knees. The fourth Talatala on the shanks. The fifth Mahatala on the ankles. The sixth Rasatala on the upper portion of the feet. And the seventh Patala on the soles of the feet. Thus the Virat form of the Lord is full of all planetary systems. Text 42, which is the last text of this chapter. Others may divide the whole planetary system into 3 divisions, namely the lower planetary systems on the legs up to the earth, the middle planetary system on the navel, and the upper planetary systems, Svaraloka, from the chest to the head of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So far in these 8 to 10 texts previously, we're seeing how we were seeing how the different planets, the 14 planetary systems, are on different parts of the Virat Rupa manifestation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But here, Lord Brahma is explaining to Narada Muni that there's another conception that you can see how the planets are situated, and they're situated in 3 different levels, not 14, but 3. The lower planets, the middle planets, and the upper planets. So when we chant the Brahma Gayatri mantra, we say Bhur, Bhuva, and Svaha. So Bhur refers to the planetary systems below Earth. So as we saw here in text 40 to 41, Atala, Vitala, Sutala, Talatala, like that. Bhuva refers to the earthly planetary systems, and Svaha refers to the heavenly planets above Earth. And these are situated on the legs, on the navel, and the upper planetary systems. Okay, so that concludes this chapter, chapter 5, the cause of all causes, in the second chapter, in the second canto, 5th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam. So the next chapter is called Purusha Shukta Confirmed, and I'm guessing Sankirtan Narottam Prabhu will continue from next week. But essentially, just to summarize, here we're talking about the Sarga and Visarga aspects of creation. The original creation is coming from Vishnu. He's creating all the elements, the senses, the objects of the senses, the elements, and Brahma is using these elements for the secondary creation, the Visarga creation, to create all the different forms, planets, etc. in this material world. And we can begin to conceive the form of the personality of Godhead by seeing everything within the material world on his Virat Rupa manifestation. So this is essentially what the 5th chapter of the second of the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam is delineating. So it's 10:58 now. It's been almost an hour. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.